cursed clinic. I should have never taken this job. It sounded easy, overnight security at an abandoned clinic on the outskirts of town. The building had been shut down for decades after a series of mysterious deaths, and people in town whispered that it was cursed. But I didn't believe in ghosts. I believed in paychecks, and this one was a fat stack of cash for one night of work. The clinic was a hulking, decayed thing, standing alone in a patch of overgrown weeds. The windows were shattered, the paint peeling from its brick facade. A single flickering street lamp cast long, twitching shadows across the cracked pavement as I approached the front doors. Inside, the air was thick with dust and something else, something metallic like dried blood. The silence pressed against my ears, making them ring. I checked my phone. 11:57 p.m. Hawthorne Medical Clinic, midnight shift. First patrol starting now. I started walking, my flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the darkness. The first floor was mostly reception and waiting areas. Broken chairs, scattered patient files, an old vending machine filled with expired snacks. The second floor was worse. This had been the operating level. Rusted gurneys sat abandoned in the halls. The doors to the surgical rooms were warped, their windows covered in old, dried smears of something too dark to be rust. A cold draft slipped through unseen cracks, carrying a faint whisper. I stopped. Did I just hear that? I turned in a slow circle, the flashlight shaking slightly in my grip. The whispering stopped. I swallowed hard and continued my rounds, forcing myself to breathe evenly. The faster I got this over with, the faster I could leave. Then I saw the door. It was at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. It hadn't been opened before. My stomach turned to ice. A single plaque was bolted to the rotting wood. Operating room 306. I didn't want to go inside. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run. But my legs carried me forward, step by reluctant step, until I stood before the yawning blackness beyond the door. I reached out, pushed it open. The stench hit me first, rotting meat. The air inside was thick, wet, like stepping into the mouth of something hungry. My flashlight flickered, revealing the nightmare within. A single operating table stood in the center of the room, covered in a stained sheet. Above it, a rusted surgical light hung at an unnatural angle, its glass cracked. The walls were lined with cabinets, some of their doors hanging open, revealing rusted scalpels, syringes filled with dark, coagulated liquid. Then I saw the hand. It dangled off the side of the table, pale, motionless. A human hand. I took a step back, bile rising in my throat. Then, the fingers twitched. I dropped my flashlight. The beam spun wildly across the room, illuminating flashes of movement, a shifting silhouette beneath the sheet. I scrambled backward, my breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. My foot caught on something, and I fell hard, pain lancing up my elbow. The sheet slid off the table. I didn't scream, couldn't. The thing beneath it wasn't human. It had once been. A patient, maybe, but now it was something else. Its skin was waxy and too tight. Its mouth stretched into a permanent, silent scream. Its eyes were hollow pits, black and leaking something thick. And it moved, crawled. Not off the table, not toward the door, but toward me. My body finally reacted. I scrambled to my feet, snatched my flashlight, and bolted for the hallway. I didn't stop. Not when the whispers started again. Not when the walls began to pulse, as if the building itself was breathing. Not when I saw them. Figures in hospital gowns lined the corridors, their faces shrouded in shadow. Some had IVs still attached to their arms, the tubes filled with something black. Others had their mouths sewn shut, their heads twitching at unnatural angles. And all of them were watching me. I ran. But the clinic was changing. The hallways stretched, looped back on themselves. The doors I had passed before were gone. The whispers became voices. "Doctor, you left us. You have to finish the surgery." I reached the stairs. I had to get out. Now, I stumbled down 2 steps at a time, my breath ragged. My body felt wrong. Heavy, sluggish, like something was dragging me back. I hit the first floor. The front doors were in sight. Then, they opened. A figure stood in the doorway. I skidded to a stop, my breath freezing in my throat. It was me. I was staring at myself, but it wasn't me. The other me was covered in blood, wearing a white coat, a rusted scalpel clutched in his hand. His face twisted into something that barely resembled human expression. Then he spoke. "Doctor," he said, his voice smooth. "Wrong. We've been waiting for you." I turned to run, but the patients were behind me. Their hands reached for me, cold fingers pressing into my arms, my chest, my face. I fought, screaming, thrashing, but it was no use. The last thing I saw before everything went black was my own face. Smiling, I woke up on the operating table. The restraints were tight around my wrists, my ankles. My body felt different, heavier, like I was wearing a suit that didn't fit right. The surgical light above me flickered on. A man stood over me. A doctor. No, not just any doctor. Me, the other me. His bloodied coat was pristine, his scalpel gleaming in the dim light. "Don't worry," he said softly, tilting his head. "I'll make sure you don't leave this time." I struggled, screamed, but no sound came out. And then, he raised the scalpel. The shadows closed in, and the clinic swallowed me whole. The next morning, security arrived to check the cameras. They found my flashlight on the ground. They found my phone, my bag, but they never found me. And sometimes, late at night, if you walk by the Hawthorne Clinic, you can still hear the whispers, still hear the screams. And if you look through the broken windows, you might see a doctor in a blood-stained coat watching you. And if you're unlucky enough to lock eyes with him, you'll never leave either. The Cursed Clinic. The night was eerily still when I arrived at the old, decrepit clinic. I could barely make out the faded sign above the entrance, the letters worn down by years of neglect. My employer, a nameless security company, had called me in for an overnight shift. They said the clinic was off-limits to the public, but it needed someone to keep an eye on it for the night. Easy money, they said. The clinic had been closed for years, the rumors swirling around it growing more sinister with each passing day. It was built in the 1950s as a medical facility, but a string of malpractice suits and the sudden disappearance of patients had caused it to shut down. The authorities never fully investigated. They just sealed the building off, as if to forget it ever existed. The area around it was overgrown, and the clinic stood like a decaying monument to the past. I was told to stay inside, lock all doors, and patrol every hour. I wasn't allowed to leave the premises under any circumstances. I was hesitant at first. I had heard the whispers, the stories about the place being cursed. People said the doctors and nurses were not what they seemed, that they had experimented on patients in horrific ways, that they had performed rituals in the name of something unholy. But none of it mattered. I didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or anything supernatural. When the night shift started, it felt like a regular job. I donned my uniform, checked the security cameras, and prepared myself for the slow hours ahead. I started my rounds, walking through the empty hallways, checking the rooms and the offices. The smell of mildew hung heavy in the air, mixed with the faint metallic scent of old blood. The first hour passed without incident, just the sound of my boots echoing in the empty hallways. But by the second hour, things started to feel off. I was making my way through the third floor when I heard it, a faint whisper. It was so soft that I couldn't tell if it was real or if it was just the wind moving through the cracks in the walls. I paused, straining my ears. "Help me," the voice murmured. I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The clinic was old, and the pipes often groaned, making strange noises. It was probably just the wind playing tricks on me. I continued my rounds, but the whisper grew louder, more distinct. "Help me." It was closer this time. My heart began to race. I checked my flashlight, the beam flickering as if it was on the verge of dying. The silence around me seemed to stretch, filling the space with an uncomfortable weight. The intercom system crackled to life unexpectedly. "Help me." The voice came through the speakers, distorted and garbled. I immediately checked the security system to see if someone had hacked into it, but everything was secure. There was no way the intercom should have worked. The power had been cut to the building years ago, and the system was obsolete. I pressed the button and tried to speak into the intercom. "Who's there?" I demanded. Nothing. Then, just as I thought the device had malfunctioned, I heard the laughter. It wasn't a human laugh. It was distorted, warbling, and filled with something darker, something unnatural. My pulse quickened. Something wasn't right. A loud crash suddenly echoed from upstairs. I froze. The sound came from the operating room on the second floor, room 306. It sounded like something had been knocked over, something heavy. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my curiosity, stupid, reckless curiosity, got the better of me. I climbed the stairs, my flashlight beam trembling in my hand. The hall was empty, the air thick with the smell of decay. As I approached the door to room 306, I noticed it was slightly ajar, just enough to let a sliver of light seep through. I pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from a faint crack in the wall that let in a sliver of moonlight. The surgical table in the center of the room was covered with a sheet. There were tools scattered on a nearby tray, rusted scalpels, old syringes, and other instruments that had been abandoned for years. The walls were cracked, the peeling paint revealing the scarred plaster beneath. Then I heard it again, a whisper, "Doctor?" My heart stopped. I spun around, but there was no one there. I backed up, toward the door, ready to run, when the sheet on the table moved. Slowly, like something was rising beneath it. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. I couldn't move. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if it was pressing against my chest. The sheet jerked, and then someone sat up. A figure, wrapped in the remnants of a blood-stained gown, its face obscured by a tangle of black hair. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its body was too still, too rigid, and its head, though it appeared human, twisted unnaturally, like a puppet with tangled strings. "Is that you, Doctor?" It whispered again, its voice ragged and distorted. I was paralyzed. My body refused to move. Then, the figure's face shifted, its features warping, as if it were trying to remember what it had once been. It became a grotesque, decayed mask of human skin, half-rotted, with empty, dark eye sockets. The thing lurched forward with a sudden movement, knocking the sheet off and revealing its full form. Its skin was pallid and stretched too tight over its bones. Its mouth hung open in a permanent grimace, the teeth yellowed and jagged. I stumbled back, my hands clawing for the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The room went dark, and then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of scratching. From behind me, I spun around, and the figure was no longer on the table. It was on the floor, crawling toward me, its fingers dragging across the ground with a sickening scritch-scritch sound. Its head tilted at a grotesque angle as it dragged itself forward, whispering, "Come closer." I bolted for the door. I couldn't remember how I got out of that room, how I found my way back to the stairs. The clinic had become a maze, the hallways twisting and stretching like a living thing. Doors that were once in plain sight were now missing, leaving me in an open void. Every corner I turned felt like it was pulling me deeper into the building. I could hear the others now, the patients, figures standing in the hall, their eyes wide, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Some were disfigured, others were merely shadows. But they all watched me with the same haunting gaze, whispering my name. "Doctor." I ran. I didn't stop. Finally, I reached the front door. I wrenched at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I slammed against it, desperate. I turned around, and there, in the reflection of the glass, I saw the face. It was mine, but it wasn't. I was grinning, and the grin, it stretched impossibly wide. And then I understood. I was the one they had been waiting for, the one they had been calling for, the cursed doctor who had never left. The cursed clinic. I never should have taken that night shift. It was supposed to be an easy gig. Security detail at an abandoned clinic on the outskirts of town. The place had been shut down for years after a string of malpractice lawsuits, but rumors whispered something far worse. They called it cursed. People swore they saw lights flickering in the windows, heard voices through the broken walls. I didn't believe in any of that. I just needed the money. My employer, some faceless security company, gave me a single rule. Stay inside. Lock the doors. Make rounds every hour. Simple enough. The clinic was a 3-story building with long, empty halls, rusting medical equipment, and rooms stripped bare except for old gurneys and cracked tile floors. The first hour passed uneventfully. I walked through the corridors, flashlight in hand, boots echoing in the silence. Dust clung to every surface, and the air smelled stale, like old medicine and mildew. Then I heard it, a whisper. I spun around, light slicing through the darkness. Nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe a gust of wind slipping through a broken window. But the clinic had no open windows, no airflow at all. I continued my rounds, but the whispering didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent. By the 3rd hour, I felt something watching me. I don't know how to describe it, but I wasn't alone. The air felt heavy, pressing against my chest like a weight. Every so often, I caught movement in the corners of my vision. Shadows shifting unnaturally, stretching against the dim light. And then the intercom crackled to life. A burst of static, followed by a voice. "Help me!" I froze. The power was cut to the building. No way the intercom could work. I swallowed hard and pressed the button at the security desk. "Who's there?" Silence. Then laughter. Not human. Not quite. It was garbled, distorted, as if multiple voices spoke at once. A loud bang rang out from upstairs. My gut told me to leave. I should have walked out, left my paycheck behind. But something compelled me forward. I climbed the stairs, flashlight trembling in my grip. The sound had come from room 306, an old operating room. The door stood slightly ajar. I stepped inside. The air was wrong. Thick. I could almost taste it, coppery, like blood. The room had an old surgical table in the center, covered in a stained sheet. Medical tools sat untouched on a rusted tray. And then, the door slammed shut behind me. My flashlight flickered. I turned around, heartbeat thundering. The sheet on the surgical table moved. Something was underneath it. I staggered back as the fabric began to rise, stretching, taking shape. The outline of a body appeared, a figure beneath the sheet, its head slowly turning toward me. A whisper slithered through the air. "Doctor, is that you?" I bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The figure sat up. The sheet slid off, revealing a grotesque, rotting face. Half skull, half decayed flesh, with hollow, black eyes. It opened its mouth, but instead of words, a horrible gurgling sound erupted, like something drowning in its own blood. My flashlight died, and the screaming began. Not mine. Hundreds of voices, all around me, crying, pleading, shrieking in agony. The walls pulsed as if alive, shadows slithering across them. The door flung open on its own. I ran, down the stairs, through the halls. But the clinic had changed. The corridors stretched longer, looping endlessly. Doors I had passed before were gone. My footsteps echoed in impossible ways, bouncing back at me from directions I hadn't taken. Then I saw them, figures in hospital gowns standing in the hall, heads twitching unnaturally. Some had gaping wounds, others missing limbs. They all turned to me in unison. "Doctor, stay." I bolted past them, but hands. *** cold, clawing hands. *** grasped at my arms, my legs, my throat. I fought, kicking and thrashing, breaking free just as I reached the exit. I slammed into the doors, locked. A cold breath slithered down my neck. "You belong to us now." A sharp pain stabbed into my chest. I gasped, looking down. Fingers, bony and dead, pushed into my skin. The last thing I saw before darkness swallowed me was my own reflection in the clinic's glass doors. Except it wasn't me. It was the doctor, and he was smiling. The cursed clinic. I should have listened to the warnings. Everyone in town knew about the abandoned Hawthorne Clinic. It had been shut down decades ago, after a fire gutted most of the upper floors. Some say it wasn't an accident, that the doctors had been experimenting on patients, performing unethical procedures in the name of medical progress. Others whispered that something else lurked inside, something not entirely human. I never believed the stories. Ghosts, curses, haunted places, they were just stories, meant to scare kids. But when I was offered $500 to spend a single night in the clinic alone, I accepted without hesitation. Easy money. All I had to do was document my stay, record any strange occurrences, and report back in the morning. I arrived just after midnight. The air was thick with the smell of mold and something metallic, like old blood. The building loomed in the darkness, its broken windows staring at me like empty eye sockets. The front door was unlocked, just as they told me it would be. Stepping inside, I clicked on my flashlight. The interior was worse than I expected. The walls were peeling, the floor littered with rusted medical tools and shattered glass. Old gurneys sat abandoned in the hall, their wheels rusted in place. The silence was suffocating. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Hawthorne Clinic, 12:07 a.m. The building is in total disrepair. No signs of movement so far. My voice echoed down the hallway. I shook off a sudden shiver and pressed forward. The first floor was mostly administrative offices and a waiting area, all of it trashed. Desks overturned, patient files scattered across the floor. Nothing unusual. Then I heard it. Faint click, like a door closing. I whipped around, flashlight beams slicing through the darkness. Nothing. Possible structural shifting. I muttered into my phone, forcing my pulse to steady. Could be the building settling. Still, I moved a little faster toward the staircase. The second floor was where things started to feel wrong. I stepped into what must have been the pediatric ward. Faded murals of smiling animals covered the walls, their paint peeling and cracked. Tiny hospital beds were lined up against the far wall, rusted and broken. A mobile, somehow still attached to the ceiling, creaked as it swayed ever so slightly. Then I saw the footprints. Small, dusty footprints leading from one of the beds toward the hallway. I knelt down, running my fingers over them. The dust had been disturbed recently. I was supposed to be alone. The temperature dropped suddenly, and I exhaled a cloud of mist. My breath caught in my throat as a soft, distant giggle echoed down the hall. No, it was just my imagination, just the wind playing tricks on me. I turned toward the hallway, toward the direction the footprints led. Something was standing at the end of the corridor. A figure, small, motionless, a child. I couldn't move. My flashlight trembled in my grip as I forced the beam up, illuminating the figure. A little girl in a hospital gown. Her back was to me, her head tilted slightly, her black hair hanging in tangled strands. "Hey!" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. She turned her head, just her head, a slow, unnatural twist that sent ice crawling down my spine. Her eyes were black, completely black. The lights above flickered violently. I ran. I don't remember how I made it to the third floor, only that I kept running, my heart pounding against my ribs. I didn't stop until I reached the operating rooms. It was a mistake. The moment I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. My flashlight flickered, the beam struggling against the overwhelming darkness. And then the whispers started. Not one voice, dozens, murmuring, overlapping, rising and falling like the sound of waves crashing against rock. I swung my flashlight frantically. Shadows moved along the walls, stretching and twisting. Then I saw the table, a rusted operating table in the center of the room, restraints still attached. And on it, a body, covered in a blood-stained sheet. I stepped back, shaking my head. No, 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 no. The whispers grew louder. The shadows closed in. Then the sheet moved. A low, wet gasp filled the room. The body sat up. The sheet slid away, revealing a face, or what was left of one. The skin was stretched too tightly over jagged bones, the mouth hanging open in a grotesque, silent scream. Its eyes were gone, nothing but empty, black sockets staring straight at me. "Doctor, you came back." I turned to run, but they were waiting. Figures in tattered hospital gowns, their bodies twisted, their faces frozen in masks of agony. They blocked the doorway, their heads twitching unnaturally, their mouths moving in silent chants. I pressed myself against the wall, my chest heaving. The thing on the table stood up. It laughed. The sound was a choked, gurgling noise, like something drowning in its own blood. "Stay with us." The shadows reached for me, cold, clawing fingers wrapped around my arms, my legs, my throat. I struggled, kicking and thrashing as I was pulled toward the table. No, I couldn't end up like them. With everything I had left, I tore free and sprinted toward the door, shoving past the figures in the hallway. The clinic was changing. The hallways stretched impossibly long, looping in directions that didn't make sense. Doors disappeared. The walls pulsed as if they were alive. I didn't stop. I reached the stairwell, bounding down 2 steps at a time. The whispers followed. The laughter followed. By the time I reached the first floor, I was barely breathing. The front doors were still there, still real. I slammed into them, expecting resistance, but they burst open, and I stumbled into the night. Silence. The clinic stood behind me, dark and lifeless. No whispers, no laughter, nothing. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys. My hands were shaking too hard to get the door open. Then, in the reflection of the window, I saw them, standing just inside the clinic, watching me, and standing in front of them, smiling, was me, the real me. I turned, but the clinic was empty. I was alone, or at least, that's what I tell myself, because ever since that night, I've been hearing the whispers,